you so much. First of all, Luis, thank you for inviting me. This conference is on a topic that is as dear to my heart as any could be, and it is with great excitement that I look over the conference presentations. I'm very, very sorry that the time zone differences and other constraints will prevent me from being able to attend many of these presentations, but the topics sound very, very exciting, and I very, very much look forward to seeing these ideas spread about in the field. I disagree with Luis that I had anything to do with this massive turnout of interest. I think rather it's the topic itself, which I think is just ripe and exploding right now with intellectual ferment and new ideas and new insights. And I'm very excited to be part of it. So what I propose to do today is to consider the visionary ideas of nature developed by three thinkers, Kant, Herder, and Goethe, as the fertile ground out of which German idealism and romanticism grew. And I will conclude in philosophy, both then and now. As Harold Bloom aptly put it, the Romantics were the visionary company par excellence. But what is vision anyway? I suggest it betokens imaginative grasp of grand concerns. In one of the greatest books ever written on the Romantics, M.H. Abrams recounted their striking visions of what he called natural supernaturalism, or what we might term immanent coherence. If the Romantics had a sense of nature that was imaginatively grand, how did they come by it? I want to retrieve three visions of nature that inspired German idealism and romanticism. First, Kant's notion of a Technik der Natur from the third critique. Then Herder's conception of natura naturans, or vitalized Spinozism. And finally, Goethe's aesthetic intuition of nature as the drive to form, or Bildungstrieb. There will be no mistaking the imaginative and the grand in these visions of nature. But what I want to suggest philosophically is the decisive term here to consider is grasp, begreifen in Hegel's idiom. That is to say, comprehension and insight. So here we go. Part one, Kant and the Technik der Natur. There are strong grounds for the view that Kant's thinking evolved beyond the postures of his first critique. A historical appreciation of his philosophizing must take into account how his later thought strove to resolve certain dilemmas which haunted that first great effort, his recurring and notorious sense of a gap in his system. For all too long, interpreters dwelled on the question, what can I know, as the heart of the Kant enterprise. Himself cared more for his next two questions. What must I do, and what may I hope? I delight to think that our generation of Kant studies has worked very hard to harvest insights into these matters and is coming to offer us a quite different Kant. Here, I want to press a somewhat old-fashioned question, Kant's self-avowed love affair with metaphysics, not to harp upon the pre-critical elements that lingered into his later thought, but rather to register how much he hoped to rescue on new foundations, concerns he believed indelibly etched in the human psyche about our destiny in the world. It is the Kant beyond pure reason that comes to our attention, not, of course, because reason turns out impure, which he would never concede, but because even reason has its dynamizing desiderata, to play with his term Bedürfnisse, and because we are more than reason, not, it must be insisted, simply less. And our hopes and our destinies involve us as whole beings. That makes judgment and imagination more crucial in our reception of Kant's philosophizing, and it draws our attention to such esoteric Kantian conceptions as the sublime, aesthetic ideas, and symbolic hypotyposis, topics central to his third critique. I will seek to harvest All this by attending to another remarkable Kantian phrase from that same source, the metaphor Technik der Natur. I want to explore why Kant believed it was good to think with, even if we could never conclusively, i.e. constitutively, know what it envisioned. In his critique of judgment, I believe, Kant moved from a negative to a positive notion of the antinomy, from discipline or critique to speculation or metaphysics. The positive sense urged us to think the unity of reason as the ground of our own subjectivity. In remark 2 to section 57, Kant argued that the point of all the antinomies was to force us to recognize an intelligible substrate, something supersensible, of which the concept is only an idea and supplies no proper knowledge. This he articulated even more emphatically in section 57 itself, writing, and thus here, as also in the critique of practical reason, the antinomies force us against our will to look beyond the sensible for all our a priori faculties, because no other expedient is left to make our reason harmonious with itself. That Kant used the word force in both contexts is striking to me. He suggested with it that the mind resists the notion of a supersensible realm over and above the sensible one. Such resistance, he believed, derived from two quarters: the natural human impulse to regard the sensible world as the only world, what we would call common sense, and the sophisticated philosophical suspicion of warrant for such transcendent world, what we would call skepticism. But through metaphor, Kant articulated metaphysical concerns which he restricted within the sphere of cognition proper. He would never have taken this recourse to metaphor without the ineluctable incapacity of discursive reasoning to secure metaphysics. Kant formulated this as follows, quote, "But because there is in our imagination a striving toward infinite progress, and in our reason a claim for absolute totality regarded as a real idea, this very inadequateness for that idea in our faculty of estimating the magnitude of things of sense excites in us the feeling of a supersensible faculty," unquote. That reason can think absolute greatness as a whole, that it, quote, "renders it unavoidable to think the infinite in the judgment of common reason as entirely given according to its totality," unquote, establishes that this faculty is itself beyond sensibility, i.e. surpasses every standard of sensibility, or is in itself noumenal. Quoting Kant again, "The bare capacity of thinking this infinite without contradiction requires in the human mind a faculty itself supersensible," unquote. In the absence of any sensible reference, reason cannot form a determinate insight into its supersensible object. It therefore tries to find the next closest approximation, the relation of this object to the objects of experience, and to bring this relation under logical rules. Hence, analogy is the rational form of orientation in the realm of the supersensible. Analogy cannot establish actuality. Only sense intuition can provide this. But on the other hand, there are ideas in the mind to which no sense intuition corresponds. The notion of an ens realissimum or ens perfectissimum, Kant argued, was a necessary idea for our rational process, because we could only grasp particulars in their concreteness within the conspectus of something all-encompassing. But Kant insisted that this idea was strictly regulative, i.e. heuristic, not ontological. What sort of status does such an idea then have for us? It is cognitively indispensable, and yet it is objectively indeterminate. For such a notion, Kant offered us the apt term Vernunftglaube, rational belief. Still later, in his third critique, Kant observed that in a reflective judgment, quote, "the mere rational concept of the supersensible which underlies the object and also the subject judging it, is regarded as an object of sense and thus phenomenal, unquote. That is clearly dialectical subtraction in terms of the first critique, as determining rather than determined, the supersensible, which lies at the basis of all sensible intuition, could never be a true object of cognition. But what Kant now stressed was that it could be thought, and in embodied beings like ourselves, it could also be attended via reflection. That is to say, it could be felt aesthetically. The first introduction to the critique of judgment stressed the parallel between reflection as a cognitive enterprise and art. Kant wrote, quote, "The reflective judgment thus works not schematically, but technically, not just mechanically, like a tool controlled by the understanding and the senses, but artistically, according to the universal, but at the same time, undefined principle of a purposive, systematic ordering of nature." Judgment posits a priori. Its grounding, Kant affirmed, was not merely methodological, it was transcendent, it was supersensible. And just because this transcendent grounding lay beyond the command of understanding, i.e. beyond determinate judgment and its schematism, the only recourse available to reason was symbolical expression via an aesthetic idea. An aesthetic idea initiates a movement of the mind. In Kant's words, quote, "It occasions in itself more thought that can ever be comprehended by a definite concept, and which consequently aesthetically enlarges the concept itself in an unbounded fashion," unquote. What imagination presents cannot be converted into a determinate judgment, i.e. cannot be claimed as a warranted assertion of knowledge, but only reflected upon at a higher level. After exhausting understanding's capacity to determine the concept, reason, the faculty of intellectual ideas, intervenes. In Kant's words, an aesthetic idea, quote, "brings the faculty of intellectual ideas, reason, into movement," unquote. Kant gave this process a very special name. He called it Geist, or spirit, the animating principle of the mind. Spirit, for Kant, quote, "is no other than the faculty of presenting aesthetic ideas," unquote. Kant called the aesthetic idea not simply a counterpart, but a pendant of a rational idea. And counterpart taken as pendant suggests that what Kant wanted to suggest was that there was a symbolic and expressive relationship between aesthetic ideas and rational ideas. Thus, I want to suggest not only was the faculty of reason mobilized by the inadequacy of the understanding, it was in fact the origin of this very embarrassment of the understanding, and the aesthetic idea was its own symbolic project. And that brings me back to the phrase Technik der Natur. Kant wrote, quote, "The first question at this point is, how is the Technik der Natur perceived in its products?" Unquote. Literally, before our eyes, organisms routinely appeared as self-constituting wholes, transforming themselves within their own systemic contours in a manner which defied all our constitutive explanatory models of serial causality. The only alternative principle we had at our rational disposal was the concept of purpose, which we ourselves used to superimpose our will upon mechanical process. And that is the general meaning of technique as human practice for Kant. And so we had recourse to this analogy in our conception. However, to ascribe to these empirical anomalies the principle of purposiveness was not entirely apt, even as analogy. Kant realized the analogy had a gaping flaw because these objects exceeded utterly the most elaborate form of intrinsic purposiveness human beings could design, that is, works of art. What an organism could do was, quote, "infinitely beyond the reach of art," unquote. And Kant developed this even further, quote, "We say of nature and its faculty and organized products, far too little if we describe it as an analogon of art, for this suggests an artificer, a rational being external to it, unquote. And Kant recognized that organisms organize themselves. Such, quote, internal natural perfection is not even thinkable or explicable by means of any exactly fitting analogy to human art, unquote. Kant concluded, to speak strictly then, the organization of nature has in it nothing analogous to any causality we know, unquote. And the mere existence of one natural purpose, Kant argued, required a reconsideration of the entirety of nature as a system of laws. Quote, if we once refer action of this sort on the whole to any supersensible ground of determination beyond the blind mechanism of nature, we must judge it altogether according to this principle, unquote. The issue of organic form then pressed the question of the objectivity of purposeness in nature, and the idea of a technique de nature applied to the whole of nature, quoting again, the natural things that we find possible only as purposes supply the best proof of the contingency of the world whole, unquote. Kant continued, quote, nature is no longer estimated as it appears like art, but rather insofar as it is actually art, though superhuman art, unquote. Indeed, one might go still further and suggest that nature is an agent, alive, natura naturans, but Kant did not. Cognitively, technique de nature as a metaphorical recourse leads necessarily to the idea of collective nature as a system in accordance with the rule of purposes, to which idea all the mechanism of nature must be subordinated, unquote. Such a system would have to have its ground beyond nature in the supersensible. And therefore, Kant believed that this gave us a sense for a kind of totality that went beyond anything available through a mechanical account of nature. And that meant that we had to open ourselves up to an idea of spirit, of a supersensible substrate, as the grounding idea upon which all of our understanding, explicitness, grasp of the world was founded. To the common understanding and to the philosopher alike, these are the only valid ground of proof for its dependence on an origin from a being existing outside the world, a being who must also be intelligent. In fact, doing was opening up the possibility of a whole metaphysics of Geist. We have, he wrote, therefore in us a principle capable of determining the idea of the supersensible within us, and thus also of the supersensible without us, for knowledge, although only in a practical point of view, unquote. In fact, to create the possibility of an insight into a kind of idealist metaphysics. Already, the idealist concept of Geist was latent in Kant's articulation, and it filtered through, above all in the third critique, to stimulate his successors to its outright articulation. Reading the third critique, I urge, created a specific philosophical agenda for Kant's successors. Part 2, Herder and Natura Naturans, or vitalized Spinozism. As Elias Palti has noted, quote, the study of the natural sciences of his time clarifies fundamental aspects of Herder's historical view, and conversely, the analysis of Herder's philosophy allows us to better understand the development of the natural sciences, unquote. I completely agree with that assessment. Herder had a sharp sense for the emergence of a new paradigm in the natural sciences that sought to integrate problems of organic life with problems of active principles in the physical sciences. His Spinozism entailed a specific and creative misreading of the 17th century philosopher's Deus sive natura as a theoretical resource for the articulation of a more subtle and dynamic materialism. If Spinoza provided a vehicle for Denis Diderot to dispense with God, i.e. to see Deus sive natura as atheism, for Herder, Spinoza offered a vehicle to reconstruct the notion of God, i.e. to see Deus sive natura as pantheism, as immanent, non-anthropomorphic theology. Diderot systematically sought to remove all trace of God. Herder, while consistently pursuing the immanent operations of nature, always retained a theological concern. But as both worked through the concrete issues of interpreting nature, they ended up theorizing a vital materialism. On the other hand, Diderot never embraced history of nature in the sense of what we would call development. He remained committed to a radically Lucretian sense of transemergence. For Diderot, vitalism reduced to a stark form of spontaneous generation. Herder, by contrast, was a most historicist mind. For Herder, formation, Bildung, had an inherently developmental character, whether in man or in nature. He saw increasing complexity and differentiation as an immanent principle of natural development, as an intrinsically historical character or tendency of the entire physical world. Quoting him now, everything in nature is connected. One state pushes forward and prepares another. Nothing in nature stands still. Inferior powers ascend to more subtle forms of vitality, unquote. Herder sought for a conceptual structure for this transition, and he found it in the proliferating notions of forces, Kräfte, in the natural sciences around him. Thus, Herder proposed to discern morphological universals. Quote, in marine life, plants, and even inanimate things, as they are called, one and the same groundwork may prevail, though infinitely more confused. The new discoveries that have been made respecting heat, light, fire, and their various effects on the composition, dissolution, and constituent parts of terrestrial substances, the simpler principles to which the electric matter, and in some measure the magnetic, are reduced, appear to me at least considerable advances, which will in time enable some happy genius to explain our geogony on principle as simple as those to which Kepler and Newton have reduced the solar system, unquote. The result was a theory of the world as composed primarily of forces organized hierarchically. Quoting again, the one organic principle of nature we here term plastic, there impulsive, here sensitive, there artful, is at bottom but one and the same organic power. Nature was for Herder unquestionably historical, and this figured in his reconstruction of Spinoza. What he did was to read Leibniz through Spinoza and Spinoza through Leibniz. Force and dynamism were essential to the natural philosophy, but it was equally essential that these forces be seen as immanent in nature. Though Leibniz dynamized the natural order, he refused to grant it metaphysical reality, whereas for Herder, quote, nature had the most exalted reality, end quote. And that led Herder to be much more interested in what was called at the time physical influx than Leibniz had at all been prepared to go. And indeed, to transform Leibnizian dynamism from a transcendent to an immanent monadology was precisely the way in which he wanted to reconstruct his understanding of Spinoza. He wrote, one finds dynamic polarity spread throughout the whole world order. Everywhere, two forces set against one another, which nonetheless must work together, and in which only by the combined and appropriate influence of both emerges the higher reality of a wise order, development, organization, life. All life arose in such manner from death, out of the death of lesser forces, all wholes of order and of design from light and shadow, out of diverging, mutually opposing forces. Mathematics, physics, chemistry, physiology of living beings, all seem to me to provide evidence for this everywhere. And in 1787, in recapitulating his approach to Spinozism, he demanded, quote, an end to all the objectionable expressions of how God, according to this or that system, may work on and through dead matter. It is not dead, but lives. For in it and conforming to its outer and inner organs, 1,000 living manifold forces are at work. The more we learn about matter, the more forces we discover in it, so that the empty conception of a dead extension completely disappears. Just in recent times, what numerous and different forces have been discovered in the atmosphere? How many different forces of attraction, union, dissolution, and repulsion has not modern chemistry already found in bodies? Unquote. What I want to suggest to you is how intensely Herder tried to weave together his philosophical ideas with these new ideas from natural science. His specific contribution was to elaborate on Kant's new sense of Naturgeschichte as literally the history of nature, i.e., to attempt to account for the imminent changes in physical nature discerned in the empirical record of the planet Earth. Quoting again, before our air, our water, our earth could be produced, various reciprocally dissolving and precipitating forces were necessary. How many solutions and conversions of one into another do the multifarious species of earths, stones, and crystallizations, and of organization in shells, plants, animals, and lastly, man presuppose? From rocks to crystals, from crystals to metals, from metals to the world of plants, from plants to animals, and finally to man, we see the form of organization ascend and the power and instincts of creatures simultaneously become more diverse and finally come together. Herder developed these ideas under the grand term in the science of his period of epigenesis. And he wanted to argue that this epigenesis was the fundamental genetic force operating through all forms of nature. It was fertile and unpredictable creativity in nature, a sweeping and powerful impulse in the entire natural world. Kant understood Herder precisely. In his biting reviews of Herder, he wrote, as a reviewer understands it, the sense in which the author uses this expression, i.e. genetische Kraft, is as follows. He wishes to reject the system of evolution on the one hand, but also the purely mechanical influence of external causes on the other as worthless explanation. He assumes that the cause of such differences is the vital principle, Lebensprinzip, which modifies itself from within in accordance with variations in external circumstances and in a manner appropriate to these, unquote. But this was far too open-ended for Kant. And he insisted that this genetic force was not unlimited. Instead, he claimed, one should simply accept this capacity for variation as a fixed given, incapable of further determinate elucidation, and that the proper terms for this should be germs or original endowments, i.e. the terminology he had himself developed in his essays on race. Kant could not bear the idea that Herder was dynamizing nature beyond the control and order that Kant believed was essential. And this was indeed precisely the way his time received Herder. Charlotte von Stein wrote about the way Goethe understood Herder's writing in Ideen, that man originated in plants and animals. So this was not a far-fetched interpretation of what Herder was about. Indeed, Herder conveyed to Goethe, to Kielmeyer, to Schelling, to idealism and romanticism that, quote, life for which Kant represented an inexplicable boundary concept for mechanistic explanation of nature became the central concept of the universe, unquote. All of these figures accepted Herder's notion that there was this internal organizing force, that the whole of nature should be understood as a self-sustaining organism. And Kant could not abide these ideas. What Herder called for, and all of his heirs took up, was a rejection of Haller's interdict, quote, no creative spirit can penetrate into the interior of nature, unquote. Not unlike Haller, Kant drew sharp boundaries for natural inquiry, but Herder insisted on transgressing them inveterately. And it seems to me this is the something missing in Kant that Goethe felt and that he in fact found in Herder, especially via Kielmeyer, and these were the ideas that became central to the epoch. And Goethe would compose a poem for his crucial collection Gott und Welt in 1820, which explicitly contested Haller's idea. Here's Goethe's quatrain. Into the interior of nature, O you Philistine, no created spirit can penetrate. Happy he who can know the mere outer shell. I've heard that repeated for 60 years now. It offended Goethe's deepest conviction that nature should hide secrets from a trained sensibility. And here lie some of the grounds that I have argued for my entire career make Herder as important to understand in the shaping of German scientific and idealist ideas as Kant. Notwithstanding Schelling's deliberate suppression of Herder's influence on his thought for the sake of authenticating his own Kantianism, only by combining these streams of Kant and Herder can we understand the enormous energy of Naturphilosophie. Part 3, Goethe's aesthetic intuition of nature as Bildung. Asked in the late 1820s to reflect upon a panegyric to nature that had recently come to light and seemed to be written in his own hand, Goethe declared that he could not recollect composing it. And in fact, it was written by Georg Christoph Tobler in the late 1780s, early 1780s rather. But he affirmed that he found in the text that it reflected accurately the ideas to which my understanding had then attained, unquote. Then referred to the high tide of Sturm und Drang, and as Goethe noted, the tendency toward a form of pantheism tallied with his own Spinozistic views of the time. In an essay composed during the Pantheismus-Streit of the later 1780s, Goethe wrote, quote, "The things we call the parts in every living being are so inseparable from the whole that they may be understood only in and with the whole," unquote. So much for needing Kant to give us that idea of organic form. When he journeyed to Italy in the 1780s, he ostensibly went there to renew himself as poet and artist. But upon his return, Goethe could scarce devote any energy to poetic projects. Instead, he devoted himself to what he viewed as a new calling as a natural scientist. And even during the Italian years, he had a clear sense of what that project would be. He wrote to Charlotte von Stein on June 8, 1787, quote, "I am very close to the secret of plant organization. With this model and the knowledge how to use it, one could go on forever inventing plants that would be consistent and would have an inner necessity in truth," unquote. Still earlier, on July 10, 1786, he wrote to her, quote, "I am beginning to grow aware of the essential form with which, as it were, nature always plays and from which she produces her great variety," unquote. Thus, in the course of his Italian experience, Goethe clearly arrived at a sophisticated conception, a vision of morphology. It applied, of course, to plants. But what was clear from his letters to von Stein is that he believed that he had come upon a universal principle which applied to all realms of nature, I'm quoting now, the whole realm, unquote. His language of phenomena and cognate constructions throughout his later writings indicate that this model remained at the core of his thought. By the time he returned from Italy, type and metamorphosis dominated his writings, not only on botany, but on zoology. By 1800, they came to be complemented, especially via his engagement with Schelling, by the notions of polarität and Steigerung. These two concepts have come down to us as the quintessence of Goethe's vision of morphology, and more than that, the fountainhead of much that we associate with Naturphilosophie. Goethe published his attempt to explain the metamorphosis of plants in 1790, just weeks before Kant's critique of judgment appeared. He read Kant's book by October of that year, and Kant would preoccupy him for some time thereafter. Goethe admitted that up to his encounter with Schiller in 1793, he, quote, "had no sense of philosophy in the real meaning of the word," unquote. His reading of Kant's critique of pure reason had been fruitless. He grasped only that he himself operated, quote, "with unconscious naivete. I truly believed that my eyes beheld what my mind thought true," unquote. But, quote, "then the critique of judgment fell into my hands," he went on, delighted because in this work, quote, "products of art and nature were dealt with alike. The products of these two infinitely vast worlds were shown to exist for their own sake. I was glad to find poetry and comparative science related so closely, and this occasioned a wonderful period in my life." Kant's aesthetic normal idea spoke both to Goethe's artistic practice and insight, as well as to his notion of empirical practice in science. The mind was active for Goethe, but it was imaginative and interpretive, not simply discursive, as Kant conceived it in his first critique. This notion of aesthetic intuition, anschauende Urteilskraft, informed the delicate empiricism, zarte Empirie, that Goethe advocated in empirical science. He made plain that the sensibilities associated with the aesthetic had a crucial role to play in the imaginative and interpretive practices of empirical science, insisting, quote, if we would succeed to some degree to a living view of nature, we must attempt to remain as active and as plastic as the example she sets for us, unquote. What higher synthesis is there than a living organism? Why would we submit ourselves to the torments of anatomy, physiology, and psychology, if not to reach some concept of the whole, unquote? Goethe's approach, aesthetic approach to science, embodied an impulse to objectivity that Daston and Galison have discerned as the view of scientific objectivity that dominated in the 18th century and early 19th century. It was the goal of science then not to note every idiosyncrasy of the specific empirical observation, but to see through the observation to the principle it expressed. Goethe put it clearly, quote, phenomena which others of us may call facts are certain and definite by nature, but often uncertain and fluctuating in appearance. There are many empirical fractions which must be discarded if we are to arrive at a pure, constant phenomenon to establish a type of ideal, unquote. It was never the particular manifestation, but always this process of realization that Goethe sought to understand. He made a contrast in the German language between Gestalt as one of these fixed images and Bildung as this process of formation. And this was what he sought as the key to his notion of morphology. He was after not only the structure, but the design and impulse that led to that structure. It was lawful, it was concrete, and it was developmental, not only in its outcome, but in its very process. Life changed its expressions, whereas inanimate matter simply reiterated its manifestations. And so what Goethe did was try to come up with morphology as this system of developmental form. We need to register that this process nature of Goethe's thought was the key to the whole notion of morphology. In his famous reflection on the influence of Kant, Goethe summed all this up pointedly, quote, in the end, the phenomena must form a series, or rather overlap. Thus, they give the scientist a picture of some organization by which the inner life of the phenomenon becomes manifest as a whole, unquote. This is simply to transgress Kant's transcendental strictures on human knowledge. And Goethe knew that. It is similarly to transgress the Kant-inspired insistence that proper scientific knowledge must proceed from parts to whole in unidirectional temporality, the core maxim of mechanism. Famously, Goethe claimed that despite Kant's reservations, yet inspired by Kant himself, quote, there was nothing further to prevent me from boldly embarking on this adventure of reason, unquote. This, in my view, is the most dramatic instance of a fundamental pattern of the 1790s and beyond in the reception of Kant, namely that his warnings were ignored and the possibilities that had provoked them became the driving concerns of the age. What is most striking about Goethe's intuition about the Urphänomen is that it seemed compatible with the utterly metaphysical conviction that the natural world had to be grasped as living, that is, as agential and creative, and in just that measure, spirit, not just inert matter. The key spirit of the epoch of German idealism and romanticism was to shift from product to process, from natura naturata to natura naturans. Spinozism in Herder's vitalist vision inspired that age. Let me conclude with some few very unscientific remarks. The visions of nature in Kant, Herder, and Goethe inspired not only metaphysicians like Schelling and Hegel, or poet-philosophers like Novalis and Schlegel, but even grand natural scientists, most notably Alexander von Humboldt. Yet one might still query philosophically, what place should vision have in philosophy? I suspect you will share my sense that especially late modern philosophy has been quite leery of it, ostensibly for the sake of rigor or pragmatism or modesty in descending order of self-assurance. Like a recent American president, the Honorable George Herbert Bush, philosophy finds the vision thing a source of chagrin. Much recent philosophy has opted for the most prosaic dissection of small issues. And indeed, if the scope is narrow enough, hitting the target becomes fairly predictable. The question that remains for me is, so what? I do not mean to confuse precision with triviality, but my concern is rather with our need for the grand, however fuzzy its logic. To invoke Shakespeare's Hamlet, there are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio, that are dreamt of in your philosophy. I would amend this only by noting that philosophy has not always been shorn of visionaries. And indeed, the history of philosophy would be a poor feast without them. The romantic hunger for wholeness has been widely scoffed at in latter days. Yet I believe the grandeur of romanticism outruns such remonstrance. As Heidegger once put it, perhaps it was not German idealism that failed us, but we that have failed German idealism. We no longer access its horizons, but that may reflect more on ourselves, that we are unfortunately like Hegel's valets who chuckle from the safety of their cloakrooms at the heroes taking the stage. For my part, I would hope we might at the least construe the Humboldt of Ansichten der Natur and Kosmos as an emulable heir of that grand age of vision. Thank you very much.